Everyone knows how Rome fell. Barbarians poured across the borders, sacked the city, and the greatest empire in history collapsed. That's the story. And it's wrong. Or at least it's the last chapter of a book everyone stops reading. Because here's a fact that should stop you cold. Over roughly 2 centuries, the Roman silver coin, the denarius, the currency that ran the largest economy in the ancient world, lost almost all of its silver. It started as nearly pure silver. By the late 3rd century, it had been debased so severely that it contained barely a trace of it. The coin was essentially a piece of base metal with a thin silver wash. Rome didn't just lose battles. Rome destroyed its own money. And what followed was inflation so severe that prices spiraled out of control. Trust in the currency collapsed, tax revenue became unreliable, and the state gradually lost the ability to pay for the one thing that was keeping it alive: its army. The barbarians didn't destroy Rome. They walked into a house that had already burned down financially. This is the story the textbooks skip. To understand the collapse, you first have to understand how the machine worked when it was healthy. Rome's empire ran on a simple, brutal financial logic. Conquest brought in wealth, treasure, slaves, land, and above all, new territory to tax. Taxes paid the legions. The legions protected the borders and conquered more territory. More territory meant more taxes. Round and round. For centuries, this worked beautifully. Rome expanded, and expansion paid for itself. But there's a fatal flaw buried in that model. And it's the same flaw that destroyed Napoleon 18 centuries later. It only works while you're expanding. Eventually, Rome stopped growing. The empire reached its practical limits. The deserts, the forests, the frontiers where further conquest cost more than it returned. The flow of new plunder dried up. And now Rome had a permanent problem. It still had to pay for an enormous army, the largest standing military in the world, guarding thousands of miles of border. It still had to fund an enormous bureaucracy, public grain supplies, games, infrastructure. The costs stayed. The conquest revenue stopped. An empire built on expansion had run out of things to expand into. And that's when the finances started to break. Faced with that gap, the emperors reached for a solution that must have seemed clever at the time. It's the same solution governments have reached for ever since, and it is one of the most destructive things a state can do to itself. They debased the currency. Here's the mechanism, and it's beautifully simple and utterly poisonous. The denarius was a silver coin. If the state was short of money, it could take the silver it had, mix it with cheaper base metal, and mint more coins from the same amount of silver. More coins, same silver. The emperor could pay the army, pay the bureaucracy, pay for grain, with money conjured out of nothing but a reduction in quality. And that's exactly what emperor after emperor did. The silver content of the denarius was cut and cut and cut again. What began as a coin of high silver purity was steadily hollowed out over generations until, by the crisis of the 3rd century, it retained only a tiny fraction of its original silver, a coin that was silver in name and appearance only. This is money printing, ancient style. The state creates purchasing power out of thin air by degrading the currency and spends it before anyone notices. But people always notice. Merchants notice that the coins are lighter, duller, worth less. Soldiers notice that their pay buys less bread than it did last year. And once people understand that the money is being watered down, they respond in the only rational way. They demand more of it for the same goods. That is inflation. And Rome had just built an inflation engine into the heart of its own economy. What followed in the 3rd century is one of the most instructive economic catastrophes in history. Prices rose, and then rose faster. As people lost confidence in the coinage, they wanted more and more of it for the same goods. The currency's collapse fed on itself, because every new debasement made the next one necessary. The state's response made it worse. Emperor Diocletian, confronting runaway prices, issued a famous edict attempting to fix maximum prices for goods across the empire. with harsh penalties for violations. It was one of the most sweeping price control schemes in ancient history. It failed, as price controls generally do. When you force merchants to sell below cost, they don't sell. Goods vanish from legal markets and reappear in black markets. Producers stop producing. Shortages get worse, not better. Rome tried to command prices into obedience and simply drove commerce underground. Meanwhile, the deeper damage was setting in. Trade and long-distance commerce, which had flourished on a stable currency, became far harder. People increasingly turned away from money entirely and back toward barter and payment in goods, a slow economic regression from a sophisticated monetary economy towards something far more primitive. And critically, taxes. When the currency is collapsing, tax revenue collected in coin becomes worth less by the time the state spends it. So Rome increasingly demanded taxes in goods and in kind, grain, supplies, labor, because its own money had become untrustworthy. A state that cannot trust its own currency is a state losing control of its economy. And an empire's army is the most expensive thing it owns. And that's the point where the financial collapse becomes a military one. Because the moment Rome could no longer reliably pay its soldiers, everything else that held the empire together began to come apart. And here's exactly how that chain broke. The Roman army was not held together by patriotism. It was held together by pay. Soldiers served for wages, for bonuses, and for the promise of land or money at the end of their service. That transaction was the foundation of Roman military power, and it required a functioning currency and reliable tax revenue. As debasement and inflation ate the value of military pay, that foundation cracked. Soldiers found their wages buying less. Emperors, desperate to keep the legions loyal, had to raise pay, which meant minting more coin, which meant more debasement, which meant more inflation. A doom loop, feeding itself. And loyalty followed the money. Armies became loyal to whichever general or emperor could actually pay them. That's a large part of why the 3rd century saw an extraordinary parade of emperors rising and falling, often installed and murdered by their own troops. Political instability wasn't separate from the financial crisis. It was a symptom of it. At the same time, the empire increasingly relied on hiring outsiders, foreign warriors serving under Roman arrangements, to fill the ranks that Roman finances could no longer sustain in the old way. The defense of Rome was gradually placed in hands that had less and less reason to fight for Rome. Now look at what the barbarians actually encountered by the 5th century. Not a rich, disciplined, well-funded empire. A state with a broken currency, a strained tax base, a fragmented and partly outsourced army, and a population that had watched its money and its stability evaporate. The invasions didn't cause the collapse. They exploited it. So what actually killed Rome? An empire built a financial model that only worked while it was conquering. When the conquest stopped, the bills didn't. Instead of confronting that gap, cutting costs or restructuring the state, the emperors chose the easy path. They quietly degraded the money. That choice bought them a few years each time, and it cost them the empire. Debasement produced inflation. Inflation destroyed trust in the currency. Broken money broke trade, broke tax collection, and broke the state's ability to pay its own army. And an empire that cannot pay its army does not stay an empire for long. The barbarians were the funeral. The cause of death was written in the coins decades earlier. Here's why this matters far beyond ancient history. Every state that has ever debased its currency to solve a spending problem has believed it was buying time. Rome believed it. Many have believed it since. But the money is not just a tool the state uses. It's the trust the entire economy is built on. Break the money, and eventually you break everything that stands on top of it. Rome fell because it lied about the value of its own coin, and eventually, reality collected. The greatest empire in history didn't die by the sword. It died by the mint. The barbarians just showed up for the reading of the will.